Faith is the victory we know that overcomes the world.
In Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42. Slowly but surely making our way through Christ's Sermon on the Mount. In the spring of 1770, a crowd gathered in Boston and a confrontation erupted between the civilians as well as British soldiers. And stones and insults and fear then flew in both directions, and then eventually shots were fired, and then many colonialists fell dead in what history remembers as the Boston Massacre. In the days that followed, there was understandably a lot of anger, and it burned hot. Many really wanted that immediate payback. The natural rule of the street was very simple. It was, well, they hurt us, right? So we hurt them back. But something unexpected happened. John Adams, a colonial lawyer who opposed British policies, agreed to defend the accused British soldiers in court. And he said that facts are a stubborn thing, and he insisted that even hated men deserved a fair hearing under the law. He knew the risk. He knew that his reputation was on the line, his safety, his standing with all of the people, but he believed that a society that was outraged, that answered in outrage, would become the very thing that it claimed to resist. Now, the trial did not ease the grief. It didn't declare that their evil was good, but it did show this, that a community either governs retaliation or retaliation governs the community. Now, we live in a world where responding in kind seems natural, almost necessary, almost like it's impressed upon us that if someone does wrong to you, you get back at them. If someone were to insult you, you insult them back, or to cheat you, or to harm you, we feel justified in returning the favor, because that's what everyone around us encourages. That's what seems right. In fact, many would argue that not retaliating is weakness. Now, that instinct is not a new one. It's an ancient instinct, in fact. Long before Jesus stood on the hillside, long before he spoke the words we'll read in a moment, human societies wrestled with that very same question: how far is a person allowed to go when they have been wronged? And it is into that ancient instinct that Jesus would then speak. Beginning in verse 38 of Matthew 5, "Ye have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth." So first off, as is common with this study thus far, we're going to start off with the letter of the law. The phrase an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, had become one of the most recognizable summaries of the Mosaic law. It was something that was short, it was easily repeatable, easy to remember. I mean, you've probably heard it said multiple times over your lifetime as well. It's still something that is said much today. Unfortunately, the familiarity with this phrase had bred a certain carelessness. People remembered the words, but they had forgotten the context that went along with them. They had memorized the phrase, but ignored the purpose. And so before Jesus ever addresses misuse or misapplication, he anchors his teaching in what was said. First, let's look at the divine origin of the law from which this summary actually came. You see, this law was revealed. It was not invented. This is not something that came about by men. The principle of an eye for an eye is not a human idea just to satisfy one's anger or desire for revenge. It originates with God, with divine instruction. God himself spoke it as part of his revealed law. Exodus 21, 23 through 25 says, "But if any harm follow, then thou shalt give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe." Now, it's important to note, though, that this phrase, this command by God, appears in the midst of legal regulations concerning injury and responsibility. It's not like we've been studying Job, right, on Wednesday night. It's not poetic language. It's not trying to be flowery or get across a symbolic statement. This is legislative. It is law for the legal situation. God is laying down parameters of justice for Israel's judicial system to follow. And so that immediately tells us something that's very important. This law is not reactive, it is preventative. God gives it before the chaos erupts, not after vengeance has run wild. This isn't something where someone insulted me, so now I'm running after them to insult them. Well, he punched me, so I'm going to chase him down and punch him. No, God is saying, before anything happens, I want you to understand the legal requirement here for Israel's judicial system is to mete out punishment befitting the crime. The law reflects God's authority over justice. Justice did not just belong to the strongest man or to the angriest victim. Justice belongs to God. The law has made that unmistakably clear. And so by defining these penalties himself, God had removed the right of personal retaliation. This phrase here is not for the one who has been wronged. No one can claim I feel justified in what I did and how I retaliated. Justice is no longer subjective. Justice was something that was to be measured against God's divine revealed standard. And so this protected the community from mob justice, from emotional overreactions. This law was a mercy, not a severity. And at first glance, the law sounds extremely harsh. It's like life for a life, right? And that's the concept that our society has latched onto. But this actually was merciful. In cultures where retaliation was unlimited, God had said no further. Right? The surrounding cultures, the surrounding peoples often, if you insulted someone, if you injured someone, then they just wipe their hands clean, right? You can do whatever you want to them. You can retaliate however you want. And God said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to allow vengeance to just continue spiraling. Instead, he chose to restrain it. The law's origin revealed God's concern for order and for safety and for fairness rather than cruelty, the cruelty of the surrounding nations. And then we look at the intended purpose of the law. The intended purpose of the law is not to set a ceiling on punishment. The law did not command retaliation, it limited it. And you'll probably have noticed that that's a very big theme, right, throughout these misunderstandings, is that things that people were saying, well, God said to do it, actually turns out that, no, God was just trying to control you from going farther than you should. Most of the laws have been treated as commands, when in reality they were prohibitions. An injury could not be answered with something greater. An offense could not be escalated. The law had a ceiling, not a floor. So God is not saying, oh, when this person gets to court, the judge has to do this, whether he likes it or not. This is exactly what must be done. He's saying, this is the ceiling, don't go any higher. Not setting the floor. The harm done defines the punishment that is allowed, nothing more. And so the law restrains the impulse of the people. It acknowledged what wrongs occur, but refused to let anger dictate outcomes. This law was also set to preserve the social order, because unchecked vengeance can destroy communities. Feuds can grow and families can retaliate and violence can multiply. Here's an illustration. You've probably heard of the Hatfields and the McCoys, haven't you? Well, the Hatfields and the McCoys, well, all of this, the whole feud that's now become known nationwide, right? It all came back to the theft of a hog. That was it. It was just the theft of a pig. And the Hatfields and the McCoys went to court, and the trial favored the Hatfields, and so they didn't get punished like the McCoys thought that they should. And so it escalated. One of the Hatfields got stabbed and shot. Then that escalated again to when the McCoys' cabin was attacked by the Hatfields, and so on and so forth. And their personal feud just fell into chaos and resulted in the deaths of multiple people, all over the theft of a pig. God's law preserved Israel from becoming like that, from becoming a society that was ruled by bloodshed. It slowed down the justice. It forced deliberation. It required a measured response rather than an emotional one. That justice wasn't meant to be immediate, it was intentional, to protect the innocent and the accused. By demanding proportional justice, the law protected both sides. The victim was protected from being ignored, and the accused was protected from excessive punishment. Justice wasn't lax, but it also wasn't ruthless. It was balanced perfectly. The proper context of the law, then, is judicial, not personal. That's the great misunderstanding, that it applied to me, but it didn't. This principle is repeated in Deuteronomy 19:21, where it says, "Thine eye shall not pity, life shall go for life, eye for eye, and tooth for tooth." And again, it is in a legal context. Again, it is talking about legal testimonies and false witnesses, and then it gets down here to this section. The context is the court proceedings. The command, "thine eye shall not pity," isn't spoken to the injured party, right? Someone who's been injured by someone else certainly isn't going to have pity on the one who injured them, right? It's spoken to the judge. The judge is not to show pity. Those administering justice were not allowed to soften the penalties based on emotion or pressure. And so it shows that it was institutional, not individual. The law also assumed investigation. Remember that section in Deuteronomy, right? It just came in a section of false witness, false testimony. One was not meant to enact this on the spot, not to act impulsively. This was something that was supposed to be investigated. They were supposed to ask questions, find witnesses. Justice was delayed on purpose. And by placing the justice in the hands of judges, God removed vengeance from individuals. Because people are very poor judges when they are angry. The law had acknowledged human limitations and compensated accordingly. But then you had the gradual corruption of the law. Now, the law over time became a slogan, an eye for an eye repeated without explanation. The words had survived. It was catchy, it was memorable, but the context had been completely lost. When laws become nothing but slogans, they lose their precision. The law was removed from the courtroom and was placed into people's personal disputes. What was meant for judges became a tool for self-justification. It wasn't obedience, it was a distortion of the law. And so this law had been reduced to permission. These people felt justified because they're like, well, God gave me permission to do this. They were asking, what am I allowed to do, rather than what justice required. The law was never meant to answer the first question, though. But then we move on to the spirit of the law, beginning in verse 39. "But I say unto you, resist not him that is evil, but whosoever smiteth thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man would go to law with thee, take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go 1 mile with him, go with him 2. The spirit of the law is one that rejects personal retaliation. When Jesus says, resist not, it's moral, it's not physical language. Jesus isn't commanding us to be passive in the face of danger. The phrase resist not is framed within the discussion of retaliation, not of self-defense, right? If you're in danger, you should defend yourself. That's illustrated later in Jesus' ministry, right? When he tells the apostles to sell their cloak and go buy a sword, right? Why would he tell them to go buy a sword? Except he wanted them to defend themselves, right? So this isn't talking about your safety, your well-being, right? This is talking about in matters of insult, in matters of retaliation. The spirit of the law teaches restraint at the point where anger wants to act. Solomon would say in Proverbs 20 and verse 22, "Say not thou, I will recompense evil. Wait for the Lord, and he will save thee." Now, Solomon doesn't deny that evil exists, but he does deny the individual's right to personally avenge it. The heart that lives by the spirit of the law refuses vengeance as its mission. Evil is not conquered by imitation. To retaliate is to let the offender dictate your behavior. The spirit of the law refuses to surrender moral control over to the one who would do wrong. Resisting evil doesn't always mean opposing it with force. Sometimes it means refusing to mirror it. And the spirit of the law governs reaction rather than circumstance. You see, circumstances provoke, can push and can poke and prod until you do something, but character is what responds. The spirit of the law trains the heart to respond in such a way that doesn't escalate the situation. Justice may still occur, but it's not something that's driven by a wounded pride. The spirit of the law also addresses personal insults. The nature of the act is an insult, not an assault. A strike on the right cheek implies that backhanded slap, an insult that's meant to humiliate, not something that's meant to injure. Jesus is addressing the personal offense, not physical danger. Right? Remember, Christ wants you to defend yourself if you are in danger. The spirit of this law is speaking to pride, rather. It's asking, what are you going to do when your dignity is challenged? Because the spirit of the law refuses to demand satisfaction. The natural response, the one that we all instinctually have, right? The one that we impulsively want to follow is to retaliate. But the law restrained it externally, but the spirit of the law restrains it internally. Again, Solomon would write in Proverbs 24:29, "Say not thou, I will do so to him as he hath done to me. I will render the man according to his work." Once again, Solomon is condemning the instinct to equalize insult with insult. The spirit of the law rejects the idea that our dignity is something that needs to be defended through retaliation, because the spirit of the law values our character over our honor. Now, honor is something that a culture will impress upon us, will tell us is so important. Honor is something that demands a response. But God doesn't care about the external honor that the world sees. He cares about your heart, which he sees. God's law demands restraint. To turn the other cheek isn't weakness, as some might say. To turn the other cheek is the refusal to let someone else's insult rule your heart. The law always sought to form a people whose strength was something moral, not something that was reactive. The spirit of the law governs loss and litigation as well. The cloak and the coat is, to understand this, we have to understand kind of what they wore back then. The coat was an outer garment. It was something like what I'm wearing right here, whereas the cloak was something that was more for warmth, more for everyday wear, like my button-up shirt, right? And then I have an undershirt underneath, just to be clear. So giving both doesn't mean that, I'll just give him everything I have, I guess. It's not something like that. Giving both means he's giving more than what is demanded. He's not allowing his anger to dictate the terms. Jesus isn't praising injustice. He's not saying, well, you should encourage this, you should encourage his actions. What he's addressing, rather, is our pride, right? Because pride wants to give someone less. Pride wants to hurt someone the way they hurt you. But humility is willing to give up more. The spirit of the law prioritizes peace over property. The law permitted legal claims. So God has no problem with you having possessions, having things you appreciate. But the law is asking the question, is winning the case worth hardening the heart? God's concern has always been one of moral posture, the moral posture of his people rather than legal rights. You might be able to say, yeah, I have the right to do this. But is that what God wants you to do? The spirit of the law also exposes what we cling to. When wronged materially, the question then becomes what matters most. The spirit of the law reveals whether trust rests in our possessions or if our trust rests in God. The spirit of the law transforms forced obligation as well. So then Jesus goes on to say, if someone compels you to walk 1 mile with him, go with him 2. Under the Roman law, a soldier was allowed to compel a civilian to carry his equipment with him for 1 mile. And this was something that tended to be humiliating. It was involuntary. It was something that was resented, but you had no choice but to do. And Jesus addresses a scenario where the law allowed that oppression. And the spirit of the law transcends obligation. Now, keep in mind, right, Jesus is speaking to the Jews. And I don't know if you've noticed in reading through your Bibles, but the Jews tended to be a very proud people. And Jesus is saying in a moment of humiliation, right, when you're at your lowest, when you feel cheated, keep giving. The first mile is forced, but choose the second mile. The spirit of the law teaches that moral freedom is not lost simply because the circumstances are unfair. Jeremiah would write in Lamentations 3 and verse 30, "He giveth his cheek to him that smiteth. He is filled full with reproach." That passage reflects the voluntary endurance, or rather, it does reflect voluntary endurance rather than coercion. It highlights the heart that absorbs the wrongs without becoming hardened by them. The spirit of the law reclaims our agency. Because when someone treats you like that, when someone treats you in a humiliating fashion, they're seeking to strip your dignity from you. But the spirit of the law restores it, not by rebellion, not by retaliation, but by voluntary goodness. The second mile isn't submission to tyranny. The second mile is mastery over one's response to insult. And the unifying principle of the spirit of the law is that the spirit of the law is about self-control. Every single example that Christ gives involves restraint. Restraint of anger, of pride, of your possessions, of resentment. The law always aimed to produce discipline. It protects the heart. Unchecked retaliation hardens the heart. The spirit of the law preserves tenderness without surrendering righteousness. And the spirit of the law was also to form a distinct people. God's people were to be recognizable, not merely by what they avoided, but by how they responded when wronged, by how they acted, how they carried themselves, how they treated others. The spirit of the law creates a people very different from the world. Not many people in the world are willing to go that second mile. But the Christian must always be willing, even if they feel justified in not. But then we move on to the fulfillment of the law. Verse 42, "Give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn not thou away." Now, fulfillment means the law reaches its intended goal. The law was always moving somewhere. From its beginning, it functioned as a guide, not a destination. It revealed God's standard and pointed forward to deeper righteousness. Paul later summarized this when he wrote in Romans 10 and verse 4, "For Christ is the end of the law unto righteousness to everyone that believeth." And the word end there doesn't mean termination, it means goal, culmination. The law aimed at producing righteousness, but it could only define it. And Jesus brought that into full expression. The law could regulate actions, but not produce a willing heart. The law commanded generosity, but it couldn't create generosity. It could restrain selfishness, but it could not uproot it. Jesus here in our text is not speaking in a language of obligation. He's not going to force us. He's not citing penalties or requirements. Instead, he's speaking of the willing response, of the choice to give rather than turning away. And that is the fulfillment. What was once required is now chosen. In fulfillment, generosity flows from disposition. Fulfillment transforms that justice into generosity. Where justice asks what is owed, or what penalty can this person incur? Well, fulfillment asks what can be given. Fulfillment moves beyond calculation. It's not a math quiz now trying to figure out exactly how much the other person can take. Jesus isn't instructing his hearers to assess worthiness or intent or repayment probability. Instead, he's simply addressing the heart's posture towards need. Fulfillment reorients the purpose of possessions as well. Once again, under the law, those possessions were a protected right. In fulfillment, though, possessions become tools for mercy. And Jesus' command isn't abolishing ownership. He's not saying you shouldn't own things or you should give everything away, but he is revitalizing that ownership. What was once held merely for self-preservation or for self-comfort is now held for service. And so that reveals the law's intended end, a people that mirrors God's generosity. It makes giving an act of faith rather than loss. To give without guarantee of return requires trust. The law commands tithes and offerings, but fulfillment cultivates faith-driven generosity. Jesus teaches that righteousness expressed through giving is not depletion, but is alignment with God's character. Fulfillment also replaces legal obligation with moral readiness. The law could define when to lend, but the fulfillment of that law defines how to respond. The law contained regulations concerning lending with interest and debt, all the technical information, the rules that restrained the exploitation of the poor. But Jesus moved beyond those regulations to something greater. The fulfilled law produces a heart that isn't closed by default, but is open. Fulfillment also addresses the instinct to withdraw. Turning away is the natural response to risk. But fulfillment doesn't ignore wisdom or discernment, but it refuses to allow fear to dictate moral posture. Fulfillment produces a willingness that law alone could not command. And fulfillment also reveals the law's true measure. The law measured conduct, but fulfillment measures the heart. Fulfillment asks, what kind of person am I becoming? It's not about checking boxes anymore. It's about whether the heart has been reshaped. It exposes the difference between compliance and righteousness. One can comply with the law and still become hard-hearted, but fulfillment produces that softness, that generosity, that willingness. And that distinction is why Jesus' teaching feels heavier rather than lighter in the law, because fulfillment demands more. It doesn't demand more in rules, it demands more in character. Fulfillment completes the moral trajectory of the law. The law began with that restraint and then moved toward intention, and then it ends with that transformation, the completion of the law. Fulfillment establishes a new way of living under God's will. So the law no longer just governs actions, it governs the heart. And fulfillment obedience is no longer merely external. The law's principles, right? The spirit of the law is internalized. And Jesus' words are bringing to light, are describing a way of life rather than an emergency exception. It produces consistency rather than compartmentalization. Under the law, righteousness could be segmented, right? You have your courtroom righteousness and your personal righteousness and your religious righteousness, but fulfillment unifies them. Generosity and mercy and openness becomes the norm, not the exception. It displays God's character through his people. The law revealed God's justice, and fulfillment reveals his character. When God's people live this out, we're not just obeying a command, we are reflecting our lawgiver, our judge. There is a reason that Jesus chose examples as an ordinary slap or a lawsuit or a forced mile. Because when he's talking about retaliation, he's not talking about murder. He's talking about something smaller, about an insult that bruises your pride, about a slight that stings, about a loss that feels unfair, an inconvenience that is imposed by someone else's power. But Jesus isn't one to let his disciples live by the law of reflex. Instead, he takes their hand and he walks them through a better way. Now that raises some questions for us. When I am insulted and the old instincts arise, what law governs my tongue? When I'm wronged and the urge to make it even with them burns, what law rules my hands? When I'm inconvenienced by someone or burdened by someone else's demand, what law governs my attitude? When someone asks and it would be far easier to turn them away, what law governs my heart? These are not easy lessons. Well, they're easy lessons to learn, but difficult lessons to implement. It's easy to get carried away, to want to turn someone away, to want to get even and to give into that. But as Christians, we must reflect God's character instead. If today perhaps you have been struggling, maybe someone has slighted you and you're hurting and you need comfort or encouragement, now is the time to come so we can encourage and comfort you. If you have any need this evening, we would love for you to come as we stand and as we sing.